Sit up here with you. I mean, earlier we had Wendell Mendel, who's my moon guru, you know, and then here you are. It's like this is a great excuse for spending 20 years to get to a point of throwing a conference, so I can sit up here with you. And it's an incredible honor, and I just want you to know that. Anybody who quotes Roger Zelazny too. I was a big Amber fan. So, yeah, I guess I'm going to toss out the definition you guys have heard me use, and then we can maybe play within this parameter. I don't know if Chris has heard this, probably not. Most of my stuff is actually me and my mother have heard it, and that's about it. But the idea of the near frontier and far frontier, and maybe that's a parameter we can start with. I've made the supposition that if the Earth is an expanding bubble of life and human exploration and potentially settlement, that we've been as far as the moon, and that's the edge of the bubble right now. And that from the edge of that bubble inward is what I call the near frontier, and then there's the far frontier. Those are soft-edged discussion points. But the idea is that when you're in the near frontier, a business plan makes more and more sense the closer you get to the Earth. So we're just starting to see, like Google Lunar X Prize, we're starting to see some people talking about Apollo 8-style missions around the moon, things like that. In the near frontier, it makes more and more sense as you get closer to the Earth for the private sector to take over the operational jobs that were, shall we say, pioneered by the Lewis and Clarks of NASA. And then in the far frontier, it makes more sense to pool our resources in the form of taxes, or as in the old days, geographic societies. We haven't gotten that far yet, but it's going to be cool to see when that starts happening. And that the further out you get, the more sense it makes to do those kinds of cultural missions. And again, it's a soft edge, and and then when you get hardcore, and one of the things that we're about in the foundation is sort of the assertion that NASA's exploration job starts essentially in LEO now, and the idea that you could take commercial transportation to LEO, and that's where things start for us. So that's sort of the premise I operate from. Everything that I just saw come from you and that you spoke about, just spot on, I think we should call that the Mars life interference thing sort of the prime directive or something like the new prime directive with the level 1 through, what is it, 4 or 6 you have now as far as contamination possibilities?
Oh, well,
We have to use the mics, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sending life out. I just, as you said, sending life out is what's exciting.
Right.
And how we think about it is, in a sense, a detail. The real big picture is sending life out.
Right. And I said that, I can't remember. I think I said it last night or something. For me, that's the big, the premise that I work from. And it really upsets people because they always want to believe in ET and life throughout the universe. But I go with an empirical premise that there's only one planet we know of that has life. And we're sitting on it. And that makes taking care of this planet really important. And you can then extend that to say that maybe it's our mission to take life to worlds now dead. It's one of my favorite phrases. And I have this slide with a dandelion on an asteroid or something I saw, and I grabbed that. And so that's sort of our mission at the top level. There's an almost theological angle that you can talk about. I don't want to say theological, spiritual. That's the idea that the universe is a dead place unless it can experience itself. And if the premise is that we are the only planet with sentient life, although I would extend this to any sentient life or anywhere, the universe is self-aware through our existence and our interpretation. So one comment that might be made there is that the universe is aware of itself through us, sensing, tasting, touching, feeling, interpreting, writing poetry about, songs about, or bitching about the climate, whatever, as we move out into the universe or other sentient beings. And that's how the universe knows of its own existence. And by the way, this is an argument for exploration because all the good stuff isn't on this one planet. So let's go out there and see it and taste it, feel it, experience it, and report on it. So those are kind of the broad premises and a sort of a framework of discussion. And I think they want us to talk about where we go from here. And if those premises kind of fit what you're about, then maybe we can just let's go wild.
I was asked some time ago to think, what is the long-term goal for astrobiology? But I use that as a phrase for human interest in life beyond the Earth, and I phrased it as to expand the richness and diversity of life in the universe, including Earth, obviously. Earth is part of the universe. And that's why simultaneously I'm searching for a second genesis of life on Mars and simultaneously advocating to determine if life, to do the research to determine if life from Earth can grow there. Because if there isn't life there, then we want to put life there. Because to my mind, echoing what Rick said, when you look out and look in or look anywhere, the only place I think you can find any basis for value or any sort of motivation is in the phenomenon of life. And most cultures trace that back to God, but if you just say life, you can stop right there. That's what's really important. That's what we see. We take it for granted because we eat it for breakfast and we eat it for lunch and we sweep it out the door, and it just gets mess all over the kitchen. But when you think about it, when you stop by and think about it, and particularly when you look at other worlds and you see the lack of life, you realize how special life is. And if, as Rick just said, if it's really, as far as we know, it's only on Earth, and if it is only on Earth, that's an enormous challenge for us to step up to. And if it's not only on Earth, that's an enormous opportunity for us to learn. To me, if we go back to the question, what should NASA's job be? I think NASA should focus on that long-term goal. And Mars, the moon, asteroids all fit into understanding that, as well as exploring the outer solar system. But human exploration of Mars and the moon fits into that goal as well. And I think that's a failure in NASA's logic, is to bring together the motivation for going into space that roots itself in biology and astrobiology with the means, the best means of doing that work, and an essential mean. You can't address the question, is Mars a place where humans can live and work, without involving humans? That's not a question that rovers will ever answer. And the question of, does Mars have a long-term potential for life, is again a question that can only be answered with life. We are the probe. Life is the probe that will answer those questions about the biological suitability of these other worlds. So I think that this is a different way of saying your frontier and your inner and outer, that I would push the science community to be way out there arguing for the establishment of a long-term research base on Mars that will have a lifetime measured in hundreds of years, the way we have a long-term research base in Antarctica that's been going now for 55 years and has a new building with a design lifetime of 30 years. Well, that's 80 years. The moon and Mars are both just as interesting as Antarctica. There should be a permanent science base on the moon. There should be a permanent science base on Mars. And NASA should be operating. There may be other things on the moon, and there may be other things on Mars too. Just like now, there's starting to be other things in Antarctica. But I can't imagine that the science community of Earth would sit still for not having a research base, permanently occupied research base on the moon for the next 100 years, and the same with Mars for the next 100 years. And I don't think it's a choice. I don't see why. No one says, well, in order to go to have a base on the moon, you've got to shut down the one in Antarctica. Why should we say that in order to have a base on Mars, you've got to shut down one on the moon? So I no patience with the notion that, well, we can go to the moon, but we have to have an exit strategy. I don't want to have an exit strategy. I want to have a permanence strategy, because the scientific investigation of the moon is going to take at least 100 years. There are still graduate students lining up to go to Antarctica. We've been investigating it for 55 years. Still lining up. Right? And the major product coming from Antarctica is PhD theses. Right? And that will be the same on the moon and on Mars. That's what we will produce. That'll be the information payback to the Earth. Right? And that's the driver that I would argue should be what drives NASA as a government research agency. And then how we get there, How do we get to Antarctica? Well, we charter whatever icebreakers we can. Happens now to be Russian and Swedish. The U.S. icebreaker fleet is falling apart, so we charter Russian and Swedish icebreakers. The goal of having a U.S. base there, though, is driven ultimately by geopolitics, of course, but what we do there is science, and that's, I think, the same thing with the moon and Mars.
Yeah, I think we're going to find ourselves in violent agreement through most of this. It's kind of scary. But
if you guys wanted to fight, you came to the wrong place.
It's really cool. You know, I think that this false dichotomy, I'm a moon person, I'm a Mars person, screw that. I mean, it's really not true. You know, it's all of the above. It's all of the above. If we get the right infrastructure built, and this is one reason I support the President's initiative, if we can get the right coastal infrastructure built on the deep ocean of space, then we can go anywhere and we can stay everywhere. And we can go to all of these destinations and do all of these kinds of things. And that, to me, is the goal. It's a matter of each one of us going out and doing what we want to do. The profit, as defined in space, too, can be a financial profit, as in what the private sector businesses are looking for, or a cultural profit, which Chris is talking about, the PhDs. That's a profit to our culture. That is a benefit to our culture. You know, we got to watch out that we let too many of these STEDs and ISU students out there. It's going to be trouble. There's going to be some wild parties on the moon and Mars.
So it happens in Antarctica now. It's all gone to hell.
Yeah, it's just, you know, I can't wait to see what they grow in the greenhouse. Anyway, the thing is, though, that there's all kinds of activities, too, that the private sector can leverage off of. The commercial icebreakers is a great example of that. We're not quite there as far as orbital transfer, space to space, as I call it, vehicles. That kind of area is still wide open to be pioneered by the government sector and not quite ripe yet to be handed off to the private sector. Although, again, these are soft edges. I remember when my friends were starting suborbital companies because they were going to work their way from suborbital to orbit, and here comes Elon. And he just kind of jumps to the front of the line, and there goes OSC with them because there's contract money there, and off we go, you know, and Boeing Bigelow's coming along and all of that. So what we need to see, though, is you know, somebody sent me something once, it was a long time ago, and it's about decision. And it's a matter of making the decision. Once you make the decision, everything else starts to line up behind that. And, you know, and all manner of unforeseen things come your way that enable you. We have to decide as a country or as a people that this is something we want to do. And real quick, I want to separate exploration for pure science from what may be pre-settlement or frontier-enabling exploration a little bit. They do fit together, but first to understand them, there's, what's his name, Dr. Parks or something like that. I bumped into him, I think it's him, I've bumped into him a couple times. He's like toasters in space, forget the humans. The idea, you know, people talk about robots versus people. I love that because you get that from radio people or people that are interviewing you for magazines. As a pro-settlement person, I can't have that discussion. It's like Star Trek without the voice translator. It's all garbled to me. I don't understand what you're saying, okay? Robots, toasters don't breathe, okay? Our goal is human settlement of space or the carrying of organic life into space, if you want to go to the big picture. Of course you send robots first or to places that are uninhabitable at this stage by organic life or human life. Of course you do, or it's more economical. Then you follow it with people. But to me, it's not an either-or choice. You do both, you do them in the right sequence, but the end result is human beings and Earth life on the spot. Now we have to figure out, and this is kind of our discussion here, the right mix of what our government does and enables and what we in the private sector can pick up and do that helps everybody. So toss it back to you.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to phrase it. I also don't have much patience for the false dichotomy of robots versus humans. It is deeply rooted within NASA for structural reasons. The robotic Mars program is funded in one code and human exploration is funded in another, so they compete for resources at that level. It's interesting if you look at the way the National Science Foundation organizes Antarctic exploration, they don't make that mistake. In the Antarctic Code, both the science and logistics components are together. So there's an office in NSF, National Science Foundation, and everybody that works in Antarctica, whether they're in charge of airplanes and icebreakers or whether they're in charge of biological or geological science, sits in the same office. They all report to the same boss. The overall goal of that directorate is explore Antarctica, do the science, get the people there, maintain U.S. presence, maintain U.S. preeminence in Antarctica. That's the whole goal. There's a unified concept of what that division is about. At NASA, the folks that are doing the science of the moon and Mars are over here, and the folks that are in charge of building the infrastructure or getting us there are over there, and they compete. They don't work together. It's a interesting difference, and it's a budgetarily induced, bureaucratically induced dichotomy, not an intrinsic one. But going back to what Rick ended his statement with, what is the role of NASA from inside, and I've been inside for so long I can't remember what it's like outside, from inside NASA, NASA will work best if it's given a science job, said go establish a research base on the moon and Mars and investigate those planets, bring in the best scientists, produce the best science, do what you need to do that. The same way NSF was given a charter to do Antarctic science. Now, in order to do that, we will need to send people and equipment there. We'll need to develop life support systems. We will need to do or buy or build all sorts of things. But we'll have a clear science-driven goal. Investigate the moon, establish a U.S. research base on it to generate scientific return and to maintain U.S. preeminence in any discussions about the moon, which is exactly why we have a base in Antarctica. Same on Mars. NASA could do that job very well. And if there was private sector rockets available, we would buy them. An interesting story in Antarctica. When I first started going there, all the flying was done by the military. All the helicopters, all the planes was all done by the military. Now, it's contracted out. Right? There was a transition from government-operated to private sector, and that was the result of advances in the capability of private sector companies that were now essentially capable of running polar operations, mostly because of all the work that had been done up in the Arctic supporting oil exploration. So there were now pilots and companies who specialized in this. Ken Borick developed capabilities in the Arctic, and we realized, well, why don't we charter these in Antarctica? It's cheaper than doing it ourselves. And that same transition has to happen. Meanwhile, the mission of the U.S. Antarctic program has never changed. Scientific exploration of Antarctica done in such a way as to maintain U.S. preeminence in all things Antarctic. That's our mission. And that will continue to be a mission. It's a perfectly good mission for a government organization. And that same mission statement could be applied to the moon and Mars. We sometimes within NASA get confused between the goal and the means to the goal. I don't get confused, even though I'm inside NASA. I clearly see the goal as investigation of these other worlds with the ultimate understanding of how to enhance the richness and diversity of life in the universe. That's our ultimate goal.
Yeah, one of the illustrations of this, and it's a bad anecdote or badly told anecdote, was this story that I wish Wendell were here because I think he could cover it. I think he's already left. Was the idea that after the President Bush II, or George W., gave the mandate that we were going to the moon and Mars, they marched right out of the door to go do it, and the lunar science community and the Mars science community started to gear up and started to get excited, and this is coming, and we're going to go work on this. And then the transportation guys ran off and started trying to build some new vehicle fleet to go do it. And there was an unfortunate, I think, statement, I'm going to paraphrase, please don't quote me on this, where the administrator at the time was asked, what are these vehicles for? What's the mission of these vehicles? And basically the answer was, well, we don't know. We'll figure that out later. and you know, which is kind of odd, you know, because I'm not going to build a Ferrari to deliver UPS. I need to figure out what my mission is and then go backwards. And what I saw during those years was such a disconnect between the transportation needs and those kinds of things. And it was kind of sad because I was seeing a lot of the scientists, and I was more closely related with the LEIG people and all that at the time, who were coming up with some great stuff. They were looking at some great ideas, getting very creative, and they were actually interfacing with the private sector guys. And I remember one particular session, which was at a sub-session at a NASA event that I mentioned previously that was held in Washington. And we're sitting there, and there's a scientist. Actually, I think he was at JPL. He was definitely a Mars guy, but he was interested in also in lunar geology and those kind of things. And we were talking about, I don't know if you were in the session for that one, but we were talking about the idea of digging out lunar regolith to cover a habitat and hiring a commercial firm that would dig out lunar regolith to cover a habitat. And I almost heard his light go off, like that electric sort of zoom kind of sound. And he went, you know, I can study the strata, the lunar soil strata, while you're digging the ditch for the habitat regolith. We can work together. You know, and there was like this almost a group hug in the room. And it was this kind of understanding. And by the way, then I can do stuff more cheaply because you guys will already have the tools there to do what you're doing, and we can actually multitask and multi-purpose the tools. And that kind of conversation was starting, but unfortunately, I think because of this division, the way things, the structural divisions that are there, which often force good people into bad slots, into bad decisions because it's structural, we end up with these kind of issues where we have this kind of competitions. I think your Antarctic model is making more and more sense the more I'm hearing about it.
Yeah, I've said this several times. If I was in charge of NASA and Congress agreed, I would reorganize it. I'd create, instead of having a science code and a human exploration code, which is what we essentially have now, I would have a code called Near Earth Space. And it would be the Moon, Mars, and the near Earth objects. That is the neighborhood in which science and human activities overlap. It is the equivalent of Antarctica, a place where science and human actions, our actions, are both important. Unlike the outer solar system and the distant galaxies, which are important science targets, but they're not places right now where human actions are involved. Near Earth space. I'd make that code and put everyone that's doing Mars in there, everyone that's doing Moon in there, everyone that's doing asteroids and trying to prevent asteroids from hitting the Earth, all those folks together and say, your job is to explore near Earth space. You're going to need rockets to do it. You're going to need habitats to do it. You're going to need life scientists to do it. You're going to need all sorts of folks to do it. Make it so. And separately, you have this sort of distant science code that does telescopes and outer solar system exploration. It's a different type of organization. And I would then charge that group with 4 big projects. Not exclusive, not either or, but all 4. You must do all 4 of these things. The way the U.S. Antarctic program is charged with a list of things, it's not pick 1 or 2 of these, it's do all of the things on this list. Maintain South Pole, maintain U.S. operational capabilities in Antarctica, maintain 2 coastal stations. That's the list of the Antarctic program, and it must do all of them. Well, the list I would give to this code would be sample return program for Mars, human exploration of near-Earth objects, long-term research base on the Moon, long-term research base on Mars. How and when they did the different pieces, I would leave up to them. You know, I don't know a priori whether it's best to do this one first or that one first, but all 4 of them have to be on our agenda. We need to do all 4 of those things. It's not a choice between one or the other, or this one instead of that one. We have to do all 4, and this group should be the group to test. And there's a lot of commonality. The kind of technology, the kind of science related to the Moon is related to Mars. It's related to near-Earth object. Flying out into deep space, learning how to do that to visit a near-Earth object is going to help us go to Mars, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of commonality there.
Yeah, I again, absolutely agree. And, you know, it's interesting, too. we find ourselves in a lot of our current debates because of the cultural structures that we have in place. And I just want to hit that again because I think it's not about good people or bad people. It is the fact that we have these institutional realms that are created, these fiefdoms, these pipelines, these slots for thinking that we get piped into. And then we find ourselves either working at odds with each other or against each other or having to make decisions that in a rational structure we wouldn't have to make. This kind of a structure you're talking about, basically it's get it done, figure out how to do it. Well, then common sense starts to dictate how quickly and how cheaply can I do this. And, oh gosh, the private sector can do a large chunk of this. I'm going to have more money for exploration if I'm getting my transportation or my supplies or things like that handled by the private sector because my job, as is in these mandates, says I have to do these things. It doesn't say I have to drive the trucks, build the buildings, handle the supplies, that kind of thing. My job is to do these things, period. And then everything else trickles down from that. And what is interesting is, even though that is a scientific exploration mandate, it is one that automatically, by its structure, helps create it catalyzes settlement by its structure, as opposed to creating a structure that can cause or create a battlefield between a mandate and a settlement, an exploration mandate and a settlement mandate. And yeah, I do see a hand coming up, and why don't we go ahead and you want to do this? Let's toss it on out.
Let me kind of try to spoil this Kodak moment here.
Go ahead.
And because this analogy has been brought up before, Antarctica, and all that. And the question I have to ask is the difference between a permanent research base and settlement. Mm-hmm. And kind of we have a permanent presence in the Antarctic, but we don't have settlers there. And so I was just wondering, does one preclude, is there an evolution that we could see here? Or if we set up a certain model, does that tend to preclude the other? And what forethought might we want to put there to make sure that the two can coexist?
Let me answer that, and it's a very important point. What the National Science Foundation does and has a charter to do is have a research base. It is not a settlement. We have no charter to have a settlement. And I predict NASA will never have a charter to have a settlement on the moon or Mars. That is not the business of NASA. Other folks might do settlements, but we won't. We may have a charter to establish a research base, the way we have research bases in Antarctica. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing for NASA to do. I don't think it's a reasonable thing to expect NASA to establish a settlement in the sense of kindergartens and elementary schools and that sort of thing. In Antarctica, it's interesting, the history is that no one is precluded from establishing a settlement. The National Science Foundation is directed only to establish research bases. No one has chosen to try to establish a settlement there. What has followed after government research bases has been tourism. So the history of development in Antarctica is government research bases, permanent government research bases. Well, actually, you can back up. Temporary government-sponsored visits, one-offs, then permanent research bases starting in the International Geophysical Year, and then some 20, 25 years later, tourists, and now permanent tourist bases. There are now bases in Antarctica that are operated purely for tourism. Now, I'm not saying that this is a predictive model of the moon or Mars, but I guess I'm saying two things in response to your question, Bruce. NASA will not and should not, in my view, take on settlement. It should take on a research base. If others want to do settlement, fine. If you looked at the Antarctic model, what followed the government research bases was, in fact, tourism. And at least for my money, that's not a bad prediction of what might follow on the moon, at least.
No, I agree. The government should never be in the business of settlement itself. And I threw a slide up there. Frontiers are opened by people with the support of or in spite of their governments. And I believe that. However, there is an enabling function that can occur that near frontier, far frontier model can apply to technologies as well. and there are certain technologies that the government may want to use for the ability to operate its base on the moon or Mars, ISRU type stuff, that can then cross-feed into what is usable to support private sector development, i.e. the economic driver of settlement. So those two can work together. I think part of the reason that we've seen the Antarctic issue goes beyond the relationship between the NSF function and the tourism function, and that has to do with the international treaty side of things, because you're not looking at resource utilization and those types of things. We haven't dealt with that, but that's outside of the relationship between the U.S. government and the U.S. people as far as the interaction between science and exploration and settlement. I do believe there are ways that the government, when we go into space, I have an idea I play with sometimes called catalytic contracting, where NASA might say that we want a HAB module on the moon that's got 10,000 square feet, and you'll actually be awarded if there's an economic reward built in if you make it for 15,000 feet, and you can use the extra 5,000 for anything you want. And the life support system needs to support 10 people, but if you go ahead and build it for 15 to 20, and you've got that other part, then you can do that with anything you want, and we'll buy that from you, after you demonstrate it in the Mojave or somewhere, or out in the Sahara, or downtown LA, which is pretty well an intellectual desert. But you can then take that contract, and this moves outside of NASA. You get into other parts of the government where you'll get a zero-G, zero tax write-off. What you're trying to do is get over into the black so that when you present this to your investors or your stockholders in your company, you're trying to do an additive. Oh, by the way, you get to use the meatball, because we serve NASA on the moon. So you add all these up and get a cash value out of it to the point where you can take it to your stockholders and say, now we're doing that. Now, that's helped you get across the costs of your R&D and your development and your proving your capability, and you've got a few thousand feet extra where your people can go into that same module or system on the moon, and now you can go build a second one down the street, and maybe it's going to be tourism, maybe it's going to be whatever. Another quick one I want to toss out is Bob Richards and I, for a few years, have been playing around with the idea of the dual base concept, that if you're going to train explorers to go to Mars, human explorers, and you don't want to mix up those two functions in the actual facility, the exploration function and all of that, with the community building settlement function, then you do two bases. You do a base on the far side, where the poor astronauts are over there out of sight of the Earth with built-in time delays and this and that, as if they're simulating Mars, and they're doing all of that stuff. And your support base is on the near side and is operating in a community sense, in that you've got all your support people supporting your astronauts who are practicing Mars on the far side, which is, again, a pure government function base. Doesn't have to be any private sector involvement at all in that one. But all these other kinds of contracts and all these other ways of leveraging off the private sector are being applied on the near side support base, so that you get the best of both worlds. Just an idea. Go ahead.
I got a question on the, let me read it. The question is, what experiments would you put on a lunar lander? Where on the moon would you send it? Well, the experiment that I would put on a lunar lander is a plant growth module. And where I would send it would be the easiest place that the engineers would land it. I'd be happy with an equatorial site and doing a 14-day growth mission. I'd be happy with a polar site and doing a lower light, longer mission. So to me, the important point would be grow a plant on the moon. That's what I'd like to do.
Excellent. Mine would probably be a rover that could look for molecular water or something like that, but could operate in the sort of the cryo temperatures in the shadows of the South and North Pole, and see if it could operate, go in and do a successful experiment, something like that. But I like the flower element.
I had a question. With the advent of the tourism, is there any permanent residents now supporting that industry there in the Antarctic?
Well, yes and no. There are permanent infrastructure. The Russians in particular have now established a base called White Desert. You can find it on Google, which you can find everything else. And that is a permanent base in the sense that it's staffed year-round every year. No one stays there all the time. People rotate in and out. But it's as permanent as U.S. South Pole Station, and it is specifically for tourism. There's no science activities are done that. The science activities are done at the nearby base. It's sort of like what Rick was saying, a separation between the tourist base and the science base. The Russian science base is nearby, called Novolazarovskaya, and the tourist base is White Desert, and they share a common runway, the same flights out of South Africa. It's quite a nice operation. To my mind, it's the best model in terms of logistics and commercial, mix of commercial and government-funded activities in the Antarctic. It's much better than the U.S. program, which the U.S. program does not have any shared activities with commercial partners, whereas the Russians on the other side of the continent, their flights, I went down with them last year, half the seats are people who are with government research labs, and half the seats were people who were buying tickets like you'd buy a ticket to go to South America. So it's a nice mix.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
The Mars Society says that going back to the moon is kind of a waste of our time and resources because we should just go straight to Mars and because we've already been to the moon and whatnot. But I was wondering Dr. McKay, I was wondering what your views of what the moon could support a mission to Mars. And what we should do first and second and third, and like that.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's an important question, and it's a timely question. And the first answer I would give is that whether or not the moon is useful for Mars, we should have a long-term research base on the moon. The moon is interesting enough that I can't imagine we could really think of ourselves as being a spacefaring nation, or we cannot, in the U.S., establish our preeminence in space if we do not have a long-term base on the moon. So I think that should be taken as a given. Then the question that you asked, I think very perceptively, is, well, what's the phasing? Do you need a moon base before you go to Mars, or can you not? And I think the answer is, unfortunately, we do need a moon base before we can go to Mars. I was involved with the Vision for Space Exploration, and as they were trying to figure out their strategy for establishing a base on the moon. So you've got this room of engineers working up the architecture, and it's just really hard. It's really easy for a couple scientists to draw some pictures and say, well, we'll just go to Mars. Yeah, we probably could, but we couldn't stay there. We couldn't stay there. To stay on Mars is very hard, and I think we're going to have to learn to stay on the moon first. To boldly stay where no one has ever stayed before. That's my motto.
Do you know approximately what NSF spends yearly on the Antarctic base? And I assume that the moon and Mars would be worth more, but how much more is it reasonable to ask the taxpayer to pay for those bases than the NSF base?
Yeah. That's a good question, Alan. I'm not a numbers person, but the last time I looked, the U.S. Antarctic program budget was about $500 million a year. NASA's budget is about $18 billion a year. But I don't see any reason why we couldn't have a long-term base on the moon which has run-out costs of, say, $4 billion a year. Right? That wouldn't be the initial cost or the startup cost, but I don't see why the steady-state cost couldn't be targeted for $4 billion a year, and you just make it work that way. And the way you make it work that way is the way we make the Antarctic program so cost-effective is we contract out things that can be, we hire icebreakers rather than building them ourselves, and so on. So you take the most efficient way, and if there's private groups selling rockets, buy it. Why not? Why build anything you can buy? So I would say that that's, in fact, the biggest challenge in making a permanent base on the moon is making the run-out costs no more than $4 billion. Then it becomes less than 25% of NASA's budget. you then still have headroom to do other things as well. And you don't have to have this view that putting a base on the moon is something you do for a decade and then you throw it away. It's sort of been the culture of NASA since the start, is you have a project, you work on it for a while, then you throw it away and you start another one. And I think that's not the right view as we move out. We have to take a view that we're doing things for a long, long time, hundreds of years, that we're establishing a base on the moon, and we're going to have it for 100 years. It's not something we're going to do for a decade and then move on. We don't need an exit strategy. We need a permanence strategy.
I totally agree.
Ours too.
Yeah, totally agree. And, it gets into the approach that you take initially. There's the current approach, again, the old approach, or the approach that's changing right now, is the idea that, you're only going to get a couple of shots at the moon or Mars. So load all your science in there, your hard science type stuff, and go on in there and get that done. And then you get to start from scratch with new budgets later on and start all over again. One of the discussions we were having in the LEAG and others and other groups was the idea of what you start with is frontier enabling types of technology and science experiments. ISRU, where are the resources? Why? Because you want to bring those costs, those operational costs later on down so you can get it to that lower state as quickly as possible. And again, it does mean higher costs up front. But you're also doing these technology handoffs back and forth between the private and public sector. But what you're going in to look for, you don't immediately go in and start studying the history of the solar system based on the moon unless you can do so incidentally. That is a secondary line on your chart of exploration and science. Your primary stuff is how do we live in a location as cheaply as possible, living off the land. Where's the place with the best resources to do that, the Paul Spudis type stuff in the South Pole and North Pole of the moon. You do that first. That starts to get your operating costs down long term. You go to the same place over and over again, so you get better and better at living there once you figure out where the best place to live and operate and where the resources are and easiest going, to and fro access is. Then you gradually start doing your forays out. You start doing your missions out from there after you've established a base and gotten your best economic plan in place. And if you can do the duality thing where you're carrying the private and public sector to the same location, et cetera. So it's a different approach from the abandoned in place kind of argument. The salvage stuff, we're done with it, now you can claim it as salvage and use it. This is a permanent strategy from day one, and you build it in. You look at the private sector from day one. They're not your competitors, they're your partners.
Right. And from the science point of view, that's the way it should be done. You start, I'm going to do this on the moon for 100 years. Right. I plan it from the start. That's how we did Antarctica. In the International Geophysical Year, when we established McMurdo Station and South Pole Station, it was with the intention of staying there on timescales of 100 years. It wasn't, we're going to be here for a couple of years, then we're going to pack up and go home and go somewhere else. It was, and that does affect how you start. Like I said, you bring your plants.
Okay, microphones?
This is kind of a specific question, taking it back a little bit. But when you're describing a plant growth mission, how, from the scale of growing in an environment exactly like Earth, like in a little habitat, to growing in a lunar environment, where in between that would your goal be?
Well, that's a good point, and it's a technical point about how you do the experiment. You'd probably want to have on your mission a plant growing in as close to Earth normal as you can as a positive control. You'd like to see that grow. There's some things you just cannot change, like the partial gravity. So you'd want to have at least one growth module that is as close to Earth as you can make it. And then you'd probably have a bunch of experiments going out, and you'd probably have one where nothing's likely to grow. So you'd have a whole series. I personally would like to see the Earth control, then a experiment where you're using some mixture of lunar regolith or Mars regolith, and then maybe a pure lunar regolith, and then maybe one that's maybe a hydroponics. So you got a whole mix, and that kind of design will be decided by a science team and by the botanists when they finally decide. And they won't fly a rose. Those botanists have no class. They want to fly a Arabidopsis, a little tiny green plant that doesn't even make a pretty flower, but they claim that they'll learn a lot more science that way. So I defer to their superior judgment and inferior aesthetics.
Just a quick side note on that, because I was watching your presentation before. It was kind of funny. Just a kind of funny story. I had a guy approach me at a foundation conference in LA at the time. His name was Elon Musk, and he had this crazy idea that he wanted to put a greenhouse on Mars. And now I hadn't come across this stuff yet. You probably already had it out there, but I don't. A little ignorant in some of these things, and I had just watched an old movie called The First Men in the Moon, I think it was, where they arrive and there's been the lunar race is extinct that was there, and I sat him on this couch and I said, it's California, so I said, dude, you are. I want to give you a scenario that the press is going to do, the science community is going to do with you, and that you're going to get there, you're going to fly this begonia. I wasn't even thinking roses at the time. But you're going to fly a begonia to Mars, and it's going to be beautiful, and you're going to get all this great press. And 10 years later, the humans are going to arrive, and they're going to find that there was indigenous life, but there was a crack in your glass, and your microbes got loose and killed it. And that's what they're going to roast you on in the public. And unfortunately, that was my first encounter with Elon, but it was great. And he... he went off later and actually saw what the core problem was transportation. But it was funny to see your chart up there saying how you could do it and ameliorate that. So
yeah, he actually did start a project called the Oasis Project to try to fly a plant to Mars. I was involved in it. I tried to encourage him to set his sights a little lower. He wanted to fly the first private mission to Mars, the first low-cost mission to Mars, and the first plant to Mars. I said, he basically wants to do 3 impossible things before breakfast. And I said, if you could do one of those 3, that would be pretty good. Maybe you ought to set your sights a little lower. But that's what he wanted to do, and I was happy to help. But eventually, like Rick said, what he eventually realized in that exercise was that he couldn't get a launch vehicle. We spent a lot of money designing the plant growth system. There was a company in Arizona, Paragon, that actually did the design, but couldn't get it. Couldn't launch it, and I don't know if he wants to return back to that vision of sending a plant growth system out or not. Mars is a much harder target than the moon because it's so much farther, and the landing is harder because it has an atmosphere. In that sense, it makes it easier, but it makes it harder because it's less predictable. And so it's technically a lot easier and a lot cheaper to do a plant growth module on the moon first. So I think that would be what I would push as a way to do it. And if SpaceX wanted to take that on as a goal, I, for one, would be willing to carry water, so to speak, for that goal.
Well, I think both Bigelow and SpaceX have their eyes set both on the moon and Mars, although Elon leans much more towards Mars. I know that the Dragon capsule has his wiring and that type of stuff is hardened and stuff that comes from Geosat type stuff, and he has talked openly about that and wanting to go to Mars. So any more questions? And we'll wrap this up here in a couple of minutes. Yes, sir.
Rick, maybe this is a question it's philosophical in nature a little bit. I keep hearing this recurring theme of settlement. And I'm not so sure that settlement is an end or almost a byproduct of other things, be that seeking out liberty, resources, space to grow, things of this nature. Neither Mars nor Moon appear to be hospitable locations for that. Speak to the issue of settlement as an end unto itself, as some people seem to approach it, as opposed to maybe an organic byproduct of other things, if you can.
Okay, off we go. To me, personally, the expansion of our culture in an ongoing manner is critical to keeping vitality, cultural vitality. Without an edge, the center comes apart. A human being is no more alive than when they are challenged. an individual human being. Whether it is, making a run for the goal in the Super Bowl, or in the Olympics, or skydiving, or whatever it is, when you put yourself on the edge, or public speaking for somebody, whatever it is, you do what is one step beyond what your capability is, you are no more alive than in that moment. I believe that extends to cultures. So we're in a culture right now on this planet where we are reaching a period of time where that sort of writ large cultural challenge, which induces vitality, induces change, induces innovation, induces cultural growth and evolution, let's say. What's the next step beyond democracy? I don't know. We're kind of running into some interesting ideas on the internet or the interweb, and things like that. But where do we go? What's next? And where can we try it that doesn't hurt this biosphere? We've pushed this biosphere to the max in one sense. There are people that say, let's go build cities under the ocean. You know what? That's like our, and I'm using the word sink differently than the toilet sink type thing. I'm really not in favor of doing much of that, except in ways that we can use to learn to live off planet. We need a frontier as human beings, or I think we will start degenerating. We will start putting more and more rules in place. Where do the next new starts of governments, the forms of governments, get to be practiced? Where do they? Where do we shake off, without revolution, which is a cultural refreshing, a cultural renewal exercise, where do we shake off the layers of bureaucracy that normally encrust any society over time and start a new one? So for me, if you're looking at that cultural approach, that cultural question, as opposed to the spiritual and the biological and all of that, that's the reason. I want our culture to be alive. I want our culture to be vital. I want to see new ideas being born all the time. I want to see a future that economically, when you're stuck in one place, on one planet that's a closed system, quote unquote closed, the future looks like this. And the future looks more and more narrow. It looks like this. And it's getting like this. If you break out of the box, the future does this and suddenly gets wider and wider and wider. And I want to see ever more increasing horizons for possibility, hope, practice, cultural expansion, and fun.
I just want to address your question, the word settlement. I prefer permanence. I think the scientific case can be made for permanence, but I don't see a scientific case for settlement.
Yeah,
Nor should there be, necessarily. So,
I've got a question. Well, actually, comment. Paragon Space Development Corporation, which was involved with Elon's original, or was working with Elon on the Mars plant, they're going to send something to the moon eventually as part of the, I think, the Google Lunar X Prize. So that idea is in the works. We'll see if it pans out. Yeah. In terms of settlements and things like that, have there been any studies done of infrastructure, what you need to sustain any sort of large settlement off Earth? And I think this is a key point because we tend to take the infrastructure for granted because it's always been here and it's been developed over a century or so. And if you're going to a really remote area and you have to build up that infrastructure and you're trying to attract people that have to live underground because of the radiation, which is not I don't think that's a natural state for most people. What do you need to sustain that? And infrastructure is just very costly. It's costly to build, maintain, repair, and expand. So if you guys can think about that.
Just a quick comment on that, because this is interesting. We've been talking a little about this in some of the board meetings of the foundation here, because we're in this sort of new space revolution situation where we are now, and where things, when we get to talking this comfortably, it's time to, we got to start mixing things up to the next level. And it's interesting. By the way, a real quick side note. NewSpace is the engine, it's not the destination. Let's not ever confuse the two. The destination for our side of things is settlement. And what's interesting is your question is really good, because on the non-governmental side, settlement-oriented type studies, haven't really been done since the 70s that I've seen. Real, serious types of studies. And a few of us have talked about that at this meeting. And you know, and they were generating artwork and things like that, like the space colonies and things like that. That was 70s stuff. It's time to begin revisiting those kinds of concepts, along with the exploration side and the research side, and looking at permanent research outposts and things like that. But from the settlement side, where you have community with commercial practices and families and kids going to school and this and that and the other, that type of thing hasn't really been looked at that much that I know of in the United States since about the 70s. And I think, and I'll wrap up my statement on this with this, is that that would be very useful right now, because that helps contextualize what the NewSpace guys, people are doing, so that it's not just about rich boys and their toys anymore. There's a bigger vision, and we can start pointing to where it's leading, which is cities on the moon, Mars, and the worlds and the space in between. And here's how you do it, and here's how you build, and here's how you get your mail, and here's how you do this, and here's what you do there, and la 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 la, and how it all works together. And I think that that goes back to the excitement we had in the 70s, when we thought the shuttle was going to fly 50 times a year, and it was all possible, and there were going to be colonies in space by 95. I think we're back there again. I said this before in the conference. I think we're back that period again, and I think it's a great, great question and something we really need to look at. Chris, go ahead.
I know within NASA there's no studies of settlement. There are a few studies of long-term bases, but that's it. But again, as I was saying, that's what I think we ought to be studying. And in terms of the infrastructure to support it, I'd like us to be customers rather than developers of that infrastructure.
There's another element to the question about settlements or permanence. In my view, settlement is pointless unless it leads to permanence. But that's settlement and permanence as enablers. And I think it addresses the false dichotomy, the false argument between robotic exploration and manned exploration. And one of the ways I like to put it is, scientists out there with their instruments can do so much more than instruments out there without their scientists. So if you have a place for permanent location of scientists, you can do all the exploration that you want to do, you can do all the settlement that you want to do, you can do all the development that you want to do, and all of that is part of, Rick, what you were talking about, the full panoply of human activity, economic and otherwise.
We just have to decide. Again, I got to go back to the decision, because everything else is driven by that. We have to decide, just as Chris was talking about, that the Antarctic Directorate there are decisions, and everything trickles down from that, and then there's a decision culturally above that we want permanence in our science, and that we want settlement in our culture, and the two go together, and they can be leveraged off of each other. But that decision hasn't been made at the top level. We're kind of working from the bottom up or the middle sideways on this stuff. And, you know, because again, it dictates the structures of the entity. Like he was talking about the National Science Foundation stuff. It dictates everything that trickles down from there. If we have a national law that says human settlement is the law of the land on the one side, and in the science community that we want permanent outposts on the moon and Mars, and somebody may be attached to an NEO, and you put those two together, I think amazing things could happen. We're pretty close. We want to wrap it up? Or yeah.
Rick?
Go ahead.
Over here, Dallas.
Dallas.
Hey, on the comment of the lunar settlement studies or the infrastructure needed, the AIM studies in 78, 79 related to L5 cities, they did a great job of characterizing what a community needed in terms of square footage per population unit. So there's a great list in one of those study books to go research. I've got it at home. I can't remember the title or the year.
The title is Space Settlements.
And, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
That was what I was referring to.
And then the ILLIWIG, the International Lunar Exploration Working Group, about that same era, was looking at bases, settlements in the orders of magnitude steps, tens, hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands on the moon. Right. So there may be something there too.
I think Wendell referred to one of the ones he did too.
One thing I wanted to mention, I've been reading a new book that came out that really isn't anything to do with NewSpace, but it really associates with the mentality of this group, and that's The Rational Optimist. And this book talks about why the human species prospered. And it really gives a tremendous number of examples about how isolation and the size of settlement makes a big difference. And that's something that I think we really need to consider when we look at permanence.
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that. In the Antarctic, we have permanence, but no individual stays for very long. So the longest tour of duty of an individual is a year. Most people go down for several months. So there have been U.S. crew at South Pole continuously for 55 years, so it's permanence, but nobody's been there for 55 years, and crews come and go. And certainly for the moon, that's possible. We could have a base on the moon, and we could send grad students up there 6 months doing field research, and they come back to Earth, work in their university for a couple of years, and they go back to the moon for another 6 months of field research. Then they publish their dissertation, and they go and get a real job. So that model that model can be permanent without having a separate, dislocated community. It's in communication and flux with the community back here. The major advisor of that grad student might go up for a couple days to see what their research is, just the way we do in Antarctica. You know, most of the researchers there are graduate students doing their PhD research. Their advisors show up occasionally and walk around like they know what they're talking about and leave. Right? So it's not a isolated fragment of a different community. It's communication and interchange with this community, and it's still permanent. And that's the model, at least the science model, that I would push certainly for the moon. The moon is close enough that you can do that model very effectively. In fact, it's faster to get to the moon than it is to get to Antarctica because of unpredictability of the weather. The last time I went to Antarctica, it took me 10 days from my house to McMurdo Station. And we can get to the moon faster than that. There's no weather between here and the moon, so it's actually easier to schedule flights back and from the moon than it is to Antarctica.
You know, one of the models of the government-private sector cooperation, it's been talked about before, was the idea of the old the frontier outpost idea, where the government establishes its permanent facility out in the frontier, establishes, using economic means, private carriers and this and that, the transportation to and from that outpost in the frontier. The government people in the outpost, you know, in the Old West it might have been the cavalry and the army, are doing their thing by their rules inside. And then what gradually starts to spring up outside are the trading posts. And they're using the same pipelines, shall we say, back and forth to the rest of the culture. They're trading to and from the people in the fort. And what happens is then you cut to 150 or 200 years later, and you, in this particular model, you've got a quaint historic monument of the original fort in the center of the town, and then there's this giant city built around it. And that's a good model of permanence and settlement, how they can work together. And by the way, the economics of that city are now driving new science, new universities, new educational activities and things like that. One last comment I want to make on the thing that Dallas mentioned. Isn't it interesting that at that time in the late 70s, when we were anticipating the shuttle and anticipating space stations that the government was interested in, the government was actually willing to pay. What was it, $1 million for what, or some of those studies, or the O'Neill studies, things like that? It was a lot of money to put a lot of minds on that had nothing to do directly in the path of what the government was going to build, but would help create a broader story, I think it was, that we're still feeding off of almost 25 years later.
Yeah, that was at Ames.
Yeah.
Ames is known for being full of crazy folks.
We love it.
I'm the one exception, of course.
I don't know if Pete would argue with you. Should we, are we about ready to wrap it up? Let's do it up. Go ahead then. Go ahead.
No, please.
No, I was just going to say.
Okay. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming this year. I hope you enjoyed yourself. As conference chair, the Space Frontier Foundation really likes to push the limits and get a lot of stuff in front of you that you've never heard before. We really like to brand ourselves as the thought leaders in the future of space travel and the space arena. I also wanted to, as conference chair, put it out there that you should keep your eyes peeled and your ears to the ground, since we'll be announcing the dates and the locations of NewSpace 2011 very soon. And see you all next year. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. And I want to thank Dr. McKay. It was a true honor. Sit up here with you. I mean, earlier we had Wendell Mendel, who was my moon guru, you know, and then here you are. It's like this is a great excuse for spending 20 years to get to a point of throwing a conference, so I can sit up here with you. And it's an incredible honor, and I just want you to know that. Anybody who quotes Roger Zelazny too. I was a big Amber fan. So, yeah, I guess I'm going to toss out the definition you guys have heard me use, and then we can maybe play within this parameter. I don't know if Chris has heard this, probably not. Most of my stuff is actually me and my mother have heard it, and that's about it. But the idea of the near frontier and far frontier, and maybe that's a parameter we can start with. I've made the supposition that if the Earth is an expanding bubble of life and human exploration and potentially settlement, that we've been as far as the moon, and that's the edge of the bubble right now. And that from the edge of that bubble inward is what I call the near frontier, and then there's the far frontier. Those are soft-edged discussion points. But the idea is that when you're in the near frontier, a business plan makes more and more sense the closer you get to the Earth. So we're just starting to see, like Google Lunar X Prize, we're starting to see some people talking about Apollo 8-style missions around the moon, things like that. In the near frontier, it makes more and more sense as you get closer to the Earth for the private sector to take over the operational jobs that were, shall we say, pioneered by the Lewis and Clarks of NASA. And that in the far frontier, it makes more sense to pool our resources in the form of taxes, or as in the old days, geographic societies. We haven't gone that far yet, but it's going to be cool to see when that starts happening. And that the further out you get, the more sense it makes to do those kinds of cultural missions. And again, it's a soft edge, and and then when you get hardcore, and one of the things that we're about in the foundation is sort of the assertion that NASA's exploration job starts essentially in LEO now, and the idea that you could take commercial transportation to LEO, and that's where things start for us. So that's sort of the premise I operate from. Everything that I just saw come from you and that you spoke about, just spot on, I think we should call that the Mars life interference thing sort of the prime directive or something like the new prime directive with the level 1 through, what is it, 4 or 6 you have now as far as contamination possibilities?
Oh, well,
We have to use the mics, I'm sorry.
Sending life out. As you said, sending life out is what's exciting.
Right.
And how we think about it is, in a sense, a detail. The real big picture is sending life out.
Right. And, I said that, I can't remember, I think I said it last night or something. For me, that's the big, the premise that I work from. And it really upsets people because they always want to believe in ET and life throughout the universe. But I go with an empirical premise that there's only one planet we know of that has life. And we're sitting on it. And that makes taking care of this planet really important. And you can then extend that to say that maybe it's our mission to take life to worlds now dead. It's one of my favorite phrases. And I have this slide with a dandelion on an asteroid or something I saw, and I grabbed that. And so that's sort of our mission at the top level. There's an almost theological angle that you can talk about. I don't want to say theological, spiritual. That's the idea that the universe is a dead place unless it can experience itself.
Advocating to determine if life, to do the research to determine if life from Earth can grow there. Because if there isn't life there, then we want to put life there. Because to my mind, echoing what Rick said, when you look out or look in or look anywhere, the only place I think you can find any basis for value or any sort of motivation is in the phenomenon of life. And most cultures trace that back to God, but if you just say life, you can stop right there. That's what's really important. That's what we see. We take it for granted because we eat it for breakfast and we eat it for lunch and we sweep it out the door, and it just gets mess all over the kitchen. But when you think about it, when you stop by and think about it, and particularly when you look at other worlds and you see the lack of life, you realize how special life is. And if, as Rick just said, if it's really, as far as we know, it's only on Earth, and if it is only on Earth, that's an enormous challenge for us to step up to. And if it's not only on Earth, that's an enormous opportunity for us to learn. To me, if we go back to the question, what should NASA's...
And if the premise is that we are the only planet with sentient life, although I would extend this to any sentient life or anywhere, the universe is self-aware through our existence and our interpretation. So one comment that might be made there is that the universe is aware of itself through us, sensing, tasting, touching, feeling, interpreting, writing poetry about, songs about, or bitching about the climate, whatever, as we move out into the universe or other sentient beings. And that's how the universe knows of its own existence. And by the way, this is an argument for exploration because all the good stuff isn't on this one planet. So let's go out there and see it and taste it, feel it, experience it, and report on it. So those are kind of the broad premises and a sort of a framework of discussion. And I think they want us to talk about where we go from here. And if those premises kind of fit what you're about, then maybe we can just let's go wild.
I was asked some time ago to think, what is the long-term goal for astrobiology? But I use that as a phrase for human interest in life beyond the Earth, and I phrased it as to expand the richness and diversity of life in the universe, including Earth, obviously. Earth is part of the universe. And that's why simultaneously I'm searching for a second genesis of life on Mars and simultaneously